The leading cause of death in the United States for teens and children is now guns. It's not cancer, it's not car accidents, it's not accidents in the home unless they involve guns, right? It is guns. And that's really, really scary. We like to talk about gun violence prevention awareness, and we do that in the month of February. The reason we do that in the month of February is because somewhere around February 10th to the middle of February is when our country has as many gun deaths already as every other developed country will have in an entire year.
I'm Ashley Lukens. I'm one of the co-founders of Funderhui, and Funderhui is our state's first philanthropic serving organization, or PSO. And what that means in sort of industry parlance is we're a network of philanthropic actors that are coming together, and we're trying to innovate the philanthropic serving organization in three key areas. One, to really uplift and elevate questions of equity in all that we do. Two, to really query who is a funder in this state and who belongs inside of the philanthropic conversation. And finally, to build on and promote the stories of Hawaii to the rest of the philanthropic world. We really believe that Hawaii is a place that fosters collaboration and creativity, and we want to be able to tell those stories. Our members include funders from across the state, and we provide three key programmatic outlays, one of which are these briefing calls. So our goal today in partnering with the Better Tomorrow Speaker Series is, as Better Tomorrow Speaker Series likes to say, catalyze really important conversations that matter for our state. And I was telling the panelists, I come at this with a lot of curiosity. I'm a mom of a 13-year-old, and I send that child to public school 5 days a week. And I think, like many moms right now, I want to know what is happening here in Hawaii. Is my daughter safe going to school? What are we going to do to protect our children? So I'm very happy to have our panelists here today to answer all of your questions. So I'd like to begin with Chris Marvin, who's coming to us as a consultant from Everytown. Chris, can you give us that 35,000-foot view of gun violence in the United States? What are we looking at? What's happening? I think we've all been in sort of shock after both Buffalo and Uvalde, but my understanding is that's not the total picture of gun violence. So I'd love for you to start us off.
Yeah, well, thank you, and thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here. Thinking about 19 children who died in Uvalde a couple of weeks ago, it's captured the nation's attention. It has the Senate potentially moving on some important gun safety laws. That remains to be seen, but it reminds us that, maybe most importantly, that the leading cause of death in the United States for teens and children is now guns. It's not cancer, it's not car accidents, it's not accidents in the home unless they involve guns, right? It is guns. And that's really, really scary. We like to talk about gun violence prevention awareness, and we do that in the month of February. The reason we do that in the month of February is because somewhere around February 10th to the middle of February is when our country has as many gun deaths already as every other developed country will have in an entire year, right? We are 10 times ahead of them in a very, very bad way. And returning to the mass shootings, those are just the tip of the iceberg. Right, they're a very small percentage of the gun deaths and gun injuries in this country. We again, 19 children seems like a lot. 110 people die every day in this country from gun violence, and more than 200 are shot and survived every single day. Right, so 19 children is a lot, but also in the next 3 or 4 days after that, 19 more children will die. And that's scary. 40,000 people a year. These numbers are up 33% in the last decade. And Hawaii is doing a fantastic job with our gun laws, but we're not immune to this. We've seen increases. We're probably doing the best of all the states, but in the worst country in the world when it comes to gun violence, that doesn't say very much either. So it's a very it's a scary world out there, scary country anyway for us when it comes to gun violence.
Chris Lee, I'm wondering if you can give us a sense of what's happening here in Hawaii. And I'm particularly interested in what you're seeing at the legislature.
Sure. I think just building on the fact that there are some scary stats this year. I mean, Hawaii, at least, I think to Chris's point, is the least worst of all the states, which is a terrible but also hopeful stat. We have on average roughly 60 people killed, another 70 wounded by guns every year. And these things, just like mass shootings around the rest of the country, we know are 100% avoidable because we're the only modern developed country with this problem of this scale. And when you think about it in the context of Hawaii, I mean, we've had a number of actual mass shootings going back to the Xerox shooting back in the 90s. You incidents like Diamond Head and others that dominate the news for a while. And these things, when you break them down, you realize there are triggers along the way that could have been, I think that's a terrible way to think about it. There are instances where there could have been something done to prevent them from happening. And it could have been identifying the correlation between a mental health issue plus access to weapons plus making threats or any number of other things. And that's where our laws here are really designed to try and prevent something from happening. And not just with those kinds of mass shootings, but also, of course, I think also, as Chris mentioned, we have about 30 to 40 suicides per year here in Hawaii that involve guns and easy access to weapons. And when you think about suicide, by far and away, you have 90% of the people who have access to a weapon who want to commit suicide, they're going to be successful. It's very easy. The other people who are not, it's actually quite hard to do. You end up in a hospital, for whatever reason, odds are you're not going to do it again unless you have a gun when you're successful. So the key really has been, how do we keep guns out of the wrong hands? How do we keep them away from people who are a danger to themselves or others? And that action, not just in the national context where you have bills before Congress, which is great, but ultimately, obviously, the federal government has been reluctant to do pretty much anything for decades. That action is at the state level. That is where we can intervene. And I think not only in Hawaii, but states around the country have done some really important things. So in Hawaii, we have, for example, for a long time, we've had mandatory background checks, we've had waiting periods for weapons to make sure that folks who are having a crisis aren't able to easily access weapons and turn around and use them, as we saw just in the last few weeks in some of these school shootings. Just in the last few years, we put into place red flag laws, which allow someone who is identified as a danger to themselves or others to have law enforcement intervene, remove those weapons temporarily until it's safe to return them. And in Hawaii, we actually had, this is now 2 years ago when we passed into law, we had the most aggressive of those laws of anywhere in the country, because most laws require a particular trigger, like a law enforcement agent or a doctor to act as a gateway to identify someone who might be a threat. We broadened that to include folks at schools. So that's obviously a huge focus of some of these mass shootings. And so now if someone on campus recognizes that there's a threat, they're able to initiate that process. We've banned ghost guns, meaning you got to have guns registered with a serial number, even if you're making them yourselves or compiling them out of parts. And we have just this year established the Gun Violence and Violent Crimes Commission, which puts law enforcement and mental health experts and other agencies all at the same table to be able to data share and identify what issues they can improve upon to reduce gun violence. And then finally, we've done some small stuff too, but which has had significant effect. And, for example, we want gun stores and FFL dealers to report when felons, for example, apply to get firearms. Law enforcement ought to know about that because odds are there's something going on. If weapons are stolen, we have mandatory reporting requirements so that you have to report that they've been stolen so they can be tracked. And just recently, we passed a bill which barred convicted stalkers and other criminals from being able to legally acquire weapons. And that's something which you'd think would be a no-brainer, but doesn't exist in a lot of states. So that's kind of where we're at. These pieces of the puzzle all come together to help keep guns out of the wrong hands. And it's important to note, we're never going to stop everybody if someone is wholly determined to acquire a weapon and use it. But we can stop a lot of those crimes of crisis and opportunity where people can just easily acquire weapons and then use them. And that accounts for a huge number of those mass shootings out there that have occurred throughout the United States and in Hawaii. And in states that have taken some of these measures, like Hawaii, it accounts for a lot of those that have been stopped since these protections have been put in place. So there's a lot to be hopeful for, and a lot that I think we can help share with the rest of the country.
Chris, Marvin, I know you mentioned at the top of the call that gun violence is rising, and we have Chris Lee telling us a little bit about the measures in place that are mitigating that increase here in Hawaii. But why is it that gun violence has increased exponentially over the past 15, 20 years?
I'd like to start by saying we are all very lucky to have a state senator who knows his gun policy as well as Senator Lee just demonstrated. Very impressive. It sounds like he not only knows, and hopefully his colleagues not only know what laws we're passing, but why we're passing them and why they're important. And really what we say often when we look at this at a national scope, and I work mostly on national gun issues and then in very particular states who are not doing as well as Hawaii. Hawaii should be a petri dish for sort of like what good gun policy looks like. Not only because we have great gun policy, but because we don't have interstate traffic, or at least terrestrial interstate traffic. Nobody can drive guns into Hawaii. So we are proving what it looks like without those sort of porous borders that plague other states that have good gun policies like Massachusetts or Illinois, et cetera, et cetera. The reason that we see increases is because the federal laws aren't strong enough and they are full of holes, right? So our background check law federally says that if you're a federally licensed firearm dealer, you have to do a background check on any gun sale. But if an individual wants to buy a gun online or at a gun show from someone who is not a federally licensed dealer, they can do so without a background check. It's called a person-to-person sale. And these laws were made pretty much before the internet, mostly before the internet existed, and for most of us were using it. We haven't updated our laws in more than 26 years to try to address how the gun trafficking and gun sales habits have changed. Add to that the fact that we can't change these laws. These laws aren't being changed because the gun lobby, with all of its strength and all of the members of the U.S. Congress that are beholden to them in certain ways, they are pushing an agenda that is all guns for everyone, everywhere, at any time, with no exceptions. That's how they interpret the Second Amendment. And many states, depending on who is leading their state legislatures, are loosening their gun laws, right? As Hawaii has spent the last couple of decades strengthening ours, as have California and other, Washington State. They're all strengthening gun laws. Places like Iowa, Louisiana, South Carolina, Florida are loosening their gun laws. They're making it easier for people to get guns. They're making it so that an individual can buy a gun without a background check and can open carry it in the same day down the street into a grocery store or a school. Those are the laws they're creating now. And so there's no wonder that our gun violence rates, our gun death rates are increasing across the country. And then add to that the fact that we do want to recognize this always. We talk about gun violence a lot. We talk about the threat. We talk about the criminals. Gun suicide is 59% of gun deaths in this country, right? And that is many people tell you that's a mental health issue. And of course it is. But when it's a mental health issue combined with easy access to guns, it becomes death. It becomes high death rates and high suicide rates. And you just have to look at the data that would tell us that a gun suicide attempt is 95% effective. 95% of the time, if you use a gun to attempt suicide, it will result in death. Every other potential lethal means of suicide combined is about 4% effective. And Senator Lee mentioned that. Those people end up in the hospital. When they use guns, they end up in the morgue. So combining all of that together, it's obvious why our gun death rates are increasing in the United States and in Hawaii. We've also seen a similar increase in Hawaii. Even though we're still low, we're still seeing the increase.
Thanks, Chris. Erica, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about Moms Demand Action and what you all are doing here locally and also nationally to organize families around gun violence.
Yeah, happy to. I think it's really important to remember that we have these really strong gun laws here in Hawaii, and we have the lowest gun death rate in the country because of that and our geographic isolation that Chris talked about. And I know at this moment, a lot of us are feeling really heartbroken at the mass shooting events and feeling like nothing has been done. But the reality is a lot actually has been done, and a lot of it is at the state level. As Senator Lee, talked about, we have been able to pass a lot of the legislation that's in the federal proposal already in Hawaii. So even though that bill will definitely make all of our communities safer, there's a lot of great funding in it for community mental health, for example. But the reality is we already have a lot of those laws in Hawaii, thank goodness, because of our great legislators like Senator Lee and other champions that we have in the state, House and Senate. And we need more grassroots activism in the state to do more. So we can't allow our gun laws to be weakened in Hawaii. We have to keep them strong and keep working on what's next. And we can all do something. In our chapter at Moms Demand Action here in Hawaii, we have folks working on Gun Sense Action Network. They spend an hour each week taking action from their homes, supporting volunteers, and helping pass key gun sense policies all around the country. You can help us elect gun sense candidates here in Hawaii. You can help support survivors. You can help coordinate events like blood drives, give out gun locks, which we do for free all over the state. And you can give or write testimony during legislative session. As Senator Lee, talked about, we have bills every year that are contributing to our gun safety here in Hawaii. And last session, though, we we're outnumbered about 20-1 when it came to even the most egregious of bills, like HB 2464, which was what we call a shoot first bill, or what's commonly known as a stand your ground bill. So there's a huge need for more public outreach on safe storage of guns and our extreme risk law. And I think these are major funding opportunities as well. Laws, themselves are not enough, especially in the case of a law like extreme risk or gun violence protective order, which went into law in 2020. It really does take all of us to educate each other about it to be effective. So people have to know about it in order to seek that court order and get firearms removed from someone that is in danger of hurting themselves or others. So I'd love to see more broader and deeper public engagement around that topic. And there's also really, more innovative ideas I think that we can borrow from other states and municipalities, like voluntary gun buybacks. So there's always, more things that we can do to keep the guns out of our streets and our out of people's hands that shouldn't have them. So I know it's really hard right now. It's hard to kind of take in all of the grief and all the stories of people that we've lost recently in mass shootings, but I really would ask everybody to try to get involved in their own way. If it is coordinating an event, getting involved at the legislature or with federal elections, we can make a lot of change if we do it together.
Thanks, Erica. Chris Lee or Chris Marvin, feel free. I'm wondering, how is the gun lobby present here in Hawaii? Where do we see them? I mean, if you're getting 20-1 testimony, who's organizing the gun industry here?
It's coming from a couple places, and really got to give credit to Moms Demand Action and a bunch of other groups that have done the local organizing, because they have been, the only positive presidents, I think, in this whole thing, trying to help push good policy. And, like Erica said, they're outnumbered significantly. So you have groups like the NRA and other national lobbies coming into Hawaii, and they'll fly lobbyists in to come testify, to make the rounds with all legislators, and have one-on-one meetings and talk about what is an easy sell in other states. It's a little bit harder here, but we can't take that for granted because they are making inroads. And I think if you look at this year and probably the next couple of years, it's going to be harder politically than it has been the last few years. And the only thing that changes that, sadly, is when you have another mass shooting locally. So I think it's incumbent upon us to take advantage of the opportunity we have now to educate the public, because what we don't want to see happen is a normalization of these kinds of shootings. And we just accept that this is the way of life. It cannot be changed. And politically, that removes all the ability for us to do anything, because you need people to believe that you can change it, that policy can have an effect. And that requires an engaged and sizable presence from the general public. And we need groups like moms and others to really step in and get people to the table, realizing that their voices can make a difference, because they absolutely can. It's the only reason why we have the laws we do right now. But it's on us to counter this mainland influence that's coming in right now. And that's going to take additional effort.
And I want to add one thing, actually, that's okay. The bill that Erica talked about, which was the Shoot First bill, was basically like making our self-defense laws weaker, meaning that you could defend yourself and use deadly force without having to feel like your life was being threatened, which is what our self-defense laws say now, which is good. That's how we want them. We add guns to that equation, and it's immediately, death, right? You're gonna be having more violence and more deaths. That law, excuse me, that bill was proposed by Democrats in the House, which is something you see nowhere on the mainland. There would never be a Democrat who would propose that bill in a House legislature in any of the other 49 states. So it would be Republicans. Those Democrats were influenced by the gun lobby, by a few people who flew in from the mainland who'd said, you have some constituents who really love their guns, and you should listen to them, and you should do this, and you should push this bill. And it got pushed, and it got a hearing, and it passed committee, and then it was voted down in the House, thank God, because people like Moms Demand Action are working so hard for it. But what we need to realize is that when we live in a state where like 90% of us all agree that we don't want these crazy gun laws, somebody in that 90% has to speak up, because the 1% of those who want this are speaking really, really, really loudly because they love their guns. And so that is important. They don't represent our majority in any way, shape, or form, but they are speaking to our legislators, and some of them are listening.
Thanks, Chris. Maya, I want to turn to you, because I know you have had, you've worked with communities that have been directly impacted by mass shootings. And I want to know what you learned there post mass shooting about how communities are coming together, and sort of what that grief process, but also that responsive learning process looks like.
I like the way you phrase that, Ashley. Responsive learning process. That's what the best we can hope for. Do we have the capacity to learn? So I want to just preempt all additional statements with an acknowledgement that I'm uncomfortable. I'm here representing Matsunaga Institute for Peace at the University of Hawaii, and as well as Seeds of Peace. And navigating this space is really challenging, because a lot of the things that we believe in, the proactive, positive peace building that we look at, the social emotional learning, the robust mental health services, the personal peace, the anger management, the proactive community building, these are all really good things, but we really want to make sure that these are not distractions from what should be the priority here, which are common sense, just, fair, thoughtful gun laws, right? So I'm seeing some folks who are against gun reform saying, well, this is just a mental health issue, or if the shooter wasn't bullied, or if the shooter was more connected, spiritually, that this wouldn't have happened. And so we at Seeds of Peace, we agree that these things are important, but we must not distract ourselves from prioritizing gun reform and being present in the way that Erica and the Chris's have suggested. We can not only impact policy in Hawaii, but also, of course, on the continent. And we definitely need more community engagement and activism. There have been 250 mass shootings, right, so far this year. There are lots of international examples of countries that are doing better, in addition to states, and that have been responsive in their policies, that have created real safety, places like New Zealand, Canada, Japan. Let's be imaginative. A lot of what we need to do then is to shift culture and mindset at the same time that we impact policy, have these parallel paths. And once there has been a culture shift, that will make gun reform easier. And once we have those reforms, we will be more protected and able to have conversations that matter with the broader community. I was thinking about our Matsunaga and Seeds of Peace friend, Liam Chin, who in Oakland did a reimagining public safety and policing session with hundreds of community members. And the idea was to kind of think about what is true safety. And there were, 88 recommendations that were passed. and are being, many of which are being funded and moving forward and can be instructive. I think about Hawaii as needing to do this around this issue. I think let's have not just community engagement in terms of activism and advocacy, but let's ask the community, what does it mean for you to feel truly safe? What do you need? You know, let's have these conversations so that it's nothing for us without us. That should be the measure, right? We need to have people. I think about Columbine. I was a public school teacher on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And after Columbine, people started bringing in all of the schools metal detectors and creating this really kind of awful climate. It was not a loving, beloved community of learning and growth. And I wonder, you know, that didn't make us feel safe. Well, what do we need really to make us feel safe? So those are some of the questions I think we need to explore and connect to policy. Yes, I did spend some time with Peace Studio, another nonprofit I co-founded, and Peace First, and the Parkland students, for instance. And I think, it's so important to bring youth into movement building with deep respect and in alignment with that principle of nothing for us without us. I'm very proud of these young people. And I think in terms of responsive actions, bringing them in is really critical. We saw recently thousands participate in rallies across the country organized by student-led March for Our Lives groups. We, on the National Mall, Sunday was the 6th anniversary of the 2016 killing of 49 people inside the Pulse nightclub in Orlando. One of the people who I've worked with, Scarlett Lewis, has a strong presence in Hawaii. She created, after her son was killed in the Sandy Hook shooting, social emotional learning, which focuses on courage, gratitude, forgiveness, compassion. It's very popular in Hawaii. I've visited many schools, and it does cultivate a level of optimism, resilience, a sense of, you know, kuleana and interbeing. And we can work with all of these young people to think about how to impact policy, local and global. I really think about the fact that, and Chris, you know, mentioned this, like we have not really had anything for a long time, right? The mid 1990s, I guess, the Brady Bill in 93 created the National Institute Background Check Systems, and the Assault Weapons Ban of 1994, which outlawed some military style semi-automatic rifles and guns. And that latter bill expired 10 years later and has not been renewed. And in recent decades, Washington has really acted mainly to expand gun rights. We've protected firearms industry against product liability lawsuits, and in 2008, the Supreme Court with DC v. Heller, you know, pushed, you know, that sort of individual gun right interpretation of the Second Amendment, you know, to great lengths. After Sandy Hook, we thought we were going to expand background checks to cover more gun transactions, including the gun show and internet sales that Chris mentioned, but that fell 6 votes short in the Senate. We have had some stuff in the House, passed 4 gun-related bills that go, you know, further than the tentative Senate deal that we really want to support. But these things just don't pass. So we need to get really mobilized and thinking about that. That, you know, I just heard in the news today that there's concern about, because only 19 states have the red flag laws, and is the Senate compromise, which looks promising, going to pass, because states that have the mental health you know, structure in place won't get funding necessarily if they don't have the red flag laws. So I'm already seeing a lot of some pessimism about that, and so and about the boyfriend loophole, you know, in terms of domestic violence. Who is what does that mean? People are saying it has to be real clear because we don't want to take away rights from people if it's ambiguous. So we have to make sure that we stand really firm and have a strong voice that is activating movements in that are if possible, youth-led or participating in both local and national spaces. I'll just close by saying that we at the Seeds of Peace, we have some wonderful young people in Hawaii who have led the local March for Our Lives and have utilized art and are, thinking and helping others to lead from front, beside, behind. And we do fall into that trap of thinking that this is an issue that only our lawmakers can solve. But as Erica mentions, it is not true, right? So our Youth Talk Back programs, in response to Stoneman Douglas, they gathered and created art that really changed the story and make people feel motivated, media, visual arts, music, to bring awareness, shift perspective, and challenge the narratives about gun violence. So definitely let's get educators, parents, caregivers, coaches, business community, everyone involved in their own ways. And yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, one theme I'm hearing across everybody is just the need to mobilize, both in your own homes and organizations, but also reaching out to a broader cross-section of stakeholders, including youth. When you said the name of the organization, Nothing for Us Without Us, I mean, still I get chills because of the demand that makes for youth participation in crafting the future they'll inherit. So I really appreciate that. There's a question that's floated up from the audience around domestic violence. And Maya, I know you touched on that briefly, but I'm wondering if you can help us understand sort of what role gun violence plays in domestic violence and how sort of current and proposed policy measures might address that specific subsection of gun violence, both in the US and in Hawaii. Erica, you want to take that?
Well, I was just going to say that, related to domestic violence, that social emotional learning is so important. Everytown actually put out a really devastating report, I think it was last year, about the links between misogyny and domestic violence and gun violence in our country. We are losing 50 women a month to gun deaths related to domestic violence. And here in Hawaii, it continues to be, a big issue. And we're trying to kind of build out more partnerships with the domestic violence community, with Moms Demand. And so I think that social emotional learning part is really important. That's kind of the foundation of fighting against misogyny. And I'm really lucky too to have 2 kids in a public school here in Hawaii where the social emotional learning curriculum is really strong. So I think that's just the foundation. But maybe Chris can talk more about national policy, or Maya.
But I was just going to say, the one stat from a couple of years ago when we had this discussion, which was astounding and eye-opening, and maybe Chris has better updated stats, but it was something to the magnitude of every woman who was murdered by a gun or with a gun, something like 80% of those had previously either been victims of domestic abuse in a relationship or victims of stalking or something similar to that effect. And the correlation was just undeniably and frightfully high.
One of the things that we've done well in Hawaii that I think has already been mentioned is closing the dating partner loophole or the boyfriend loophole. We say boyfriend because this is almost always male on female violence. But the dating partner loophole where this is still open federally. If you get a restraining order against a domestic abuser, if you're not married to them, then they can still go buy guns. But if you're married to them, then they can't. They're prohibited from buying guns. That makes no sense, especially in our modern society where people are living as domestic partners, may not decide to be married, or just earlier in the relationship. The other thing that comes up with domestic violence often is, I think, and this is an example of sort of undercounting the toll of gun violence, which is as high as it is. It's hard to say that we undercount it, but we try to talk about the definition of gun violence, and we use this example where if we'll use a male-female partner relationship where the man comes home with a gun, owns a gun, and he sets it on the coffee table. And there proceeds to be an argument, and he physically abuses his spouse or partner. is that gun violence, right? And the answer for us is yes, right? That gun plays a role, and she may be less likely to call the police, to fight back, to try to escape, or whatever tactics she can take to protect herself, because there's a gun that is that sort of that adds the deadly aspect to it. We use the same example when we talk about George Floyd's murder. Everybody's familiar with George Floyd in Minneapolis, and he wasn't killed by a gun, but the man who killed him was protected by 3 police officers or 4 police officers who were armed, and so the bystanders could not get there because they were that incident was protected, if you will, or allowed to happen by guns. That's gun violence. And so when it comes to domestic abuse, any use of a gun, even as a tool or a showpiece, is included. And that's why it's really important to make sure that those guns are kept out of the hands of domestic abusers. The current bipartisan deal that is on the table in the Senate that we expect them to vote on next week, we think can pass the filibuster and then pass the Senate. Then it'll go to the House and the president, which will be much easier. In one of the provisions in that will close the dating partner loophole nationally. Won't affect us. We've already done that in Hawaii. And most of that bill won't affect Hawaii. A few things will, but most of it, we're already ahead of that curve. But it's good to see that happening at a federal level.
I just want to follow up, just to put this in context, because the bill that we passed in 2016, it was House Bill 625 at the time, that I put in, closed the loophole that allowed convicted stalkers to continue to buy weapons. And as we just talked about, there's a huge correlation between stalkers and what they're ultimately possibly going to do to their partners or former partners. And the NRA and a couple local organizations come in opposed to that, saying, no, convicted stalkers should be allowed to purchase weapons. And I'm going to literally read the one thing that they're using to make that argument. And so they'll come in and they'll testify and they'll say, this bill will deny core constitutional rights to a 4th-degree misdemeanor for something as simple as sending an unwanted text, email, or phone call. And when you have legislators who are just hearing from 2 sides on this issue, that sounds like, okay, well, maybe there's something to that. But in reality, that's a complete fabrication stretch of what's happening here. And so that requires the kind of engagement and ultimately education that I think we're going to need. Because when you have something as obvious and common sense as this, that are coming in, arguing against, and convincing a handful of legislators to go along, when it comes to real core policy that we need to put in some fixes that are getting more and more difficult with our polarized climate, that bar goes higher. And we need that much more engagement, that much more education, that much more commitment on the part of the public to really come in and correct a lot of these false statements and misattributions and those sorts of things.
I'm wondering, obviously with the Citizens United, we saw corporations and industry influence given the same rights as individuals in our political process. And so that has led to just an exponential increase in corporate dollars in our electoral and our legislative processes. So one of the questions from the audience was, if we repeal Citizens United, will we see a shift? But I'm also wondering, for all of these individuals that are testifying on these bills, demanding a very specific interpretation of the Second Amendment, which would effectively legalize arming of our entire country, are they influenced by those same corporate dollars, or are they speaking to a part of an American culture that we need education and outreach to transform? Is it corporate dollars, or is it our culture?
I'll chime in. I think it's both, depending on the case and time. I can't speak for any other elected officials, but clearly there's an influence when you have a lot of money in politics and money in elections. And there's also an influence when you just have a constituency that reaches out, that's being duped into thinking that they're going to take a position on something that's going to do something it's not. And in a lot of these cases, people aren't fundamentally, even the people who come in that I'll talk to who are saying, I'm testifying to, protect my guns and ownership and all of that, by blocking this bill that would prohibit stalkers from getting weapons. Like, there's a disconnect. And I think a lot of it is the gun lobby and really gun manufacturers crafting a national campaign to convince people that their rights are on the table, and anything that could be reasonably done to stop gun violence is just bad. But it takes a lot of education. So I think there's both sides of it there.
So federally, we can't pass background checks on all gun sales, right? We talked about the internet loophole and the gun show loophole. Yet more than 90% of Americans support background checks on all gun sales, right? 85% of Republicans, 75% of NRA members want background checks on all gun sales, because even some of the staunchest gun owners who want to protect their own gun rights don't want their crazy neighbor to have a gun because they don't want something, bad to happen, whether it's a mass shooting or domestic violence or whatever. Yet the Senate can't pass that. Something that 90%, so something in every single state, there is a majority of people who want background checks on all gun sales. Every senator should be beholden to that. And the fact that the Senate can't pass it, I believe, is a fundamental failure of representative democracy. But it's also a testament to the power of the gun lobby, because in those 95% of people or 90% of people who support that, they're still going to vote for the party that they think supports them. They're still going to vote, either blue or red on the issue. And so they're going to vote for the person who won't pass background checks. And so we're stuck in this, whether it's, because it's a two-party system, because there's money in politics, because the gun lobby is strong, that it all contributes to, and really ultimately actually to culture. And it builds on that culture, right? And that culture builds from other places as well. I think it is more than just the gun culture. I think there's also white supremacy has a huge part in the gun violence, and other forms of extremism have a huge part in gun violence. We saw that in Buffalo. And so there is a lot of culture as well, but it's a lethal cocktail is what it really is.
I was listening to an episode of The Daily recently about how gun safety statistics are skewed. And one of the questions I kept asking myself is, part of the issue is maybe the general public is very clear on background checks, but the people that are voting in primary elections, which are driving who predominantly represents us in Congress, are much more skewed to either pole. Just because with gerrymandering and redistricting, you're seeing more and more extreme views being represented by representatives, because those districts are being drawn as purely Democratic or purely Republican, which is driving the parties to the fringes. So I wonder if the people also representing us in Congress only represent the people that are voting. And the people that are voting tend to not vote in primary elections, which we know here in Hawaii, it's our elections in August that matter, not November, for most of our legislative districts. Maya, I'd love to come back to you to sort of maybe hone in more on this culture piece. And I know a lot of your work is about facilitating a much more sort of peaceful culture. So that we ask ourselves, like, what does safety look like? What does a safe home look like? What's happening both here in Hawaii and nationally that's sort of helping organize that broader conversation?
I wish more, but I'm hoping that this time together will allow us to catalyze the wonderful human resources that are present here in Hawaii, and even in the nation. I mean, research does show that we are highly reactionary on this issue, right? And so we don't really, a lot of us don't do much until there's a shooting, and then we're like, oh, let's arm teachers and let's have those metal detectors, as I mentioned. And recently, Jose Barzola of the Matsunaga Institute was sharing with me, John Oliver did a spotlight on sort of school police and policy, and it showed how having police and guards in school really actually made things worse for the students. But we tend to be reactionary, and so it is time for us to take a pause and step back and analyze, what is it about our culture that is creating this type of environment that makes this the norm? We have to bring in new perspectives and proactive approach. So yes, a lot of the work that we do is about kind of envisioning the harvest. imagining our beloved community, right? And we think about what are the barriers to peace. And when we think about gun safety, true safety, we need positive peace. Positive peace is the presence of organization, infrastructure, understanding, compassion, collaboration. It's the presence of stuff, not just negative peace. Negative peace isn't negative. It's just the absence of acute violence. And when it comes to this issue, that's what we've been focused on, the absence of acute violence that we desire. But we need to do more on the positive peace side, right? And so let's really think about building those bridges and understanding true wellness and true safety, and shift those mindsets so that we're not simply defending, so that we're not buying into this notion of either you're defending the freedom to own arms or the freedom from guns. Like there's this, we have to think about, for instance, reimagining what true freedom means, and shift the language, and to think about how we start living from a place of real tenderness, connection, and not fear, that real sense of responsibility that will prevent these kinds of senseless acts. So I do think that a lot of the work of Everytown, it's a great resource. And we can get involved with requiring background checks and restricting, assault weapons and high capacity magazines and keeping guns out of the hands of domestic abusers and so on. But we also really need to think about, not just educating ourselves, but really recommitting to creating a culture of peace. And here, and from Hawaii, the notion of aloha and what that means, it's not something that is tepid, right? It can be incredibly powerful and instructive on a nationwide level, and to think about looking at community health, and partnering with peace educators, counselors, and using some of the resources of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. There are a lot of ideas for how to move from post-traumatic stress to post-traumatic growth, and having that strength-based approach is going to be critical. What are our gifts? What are our strengths? How can we engage in the critical thinking and courage that's necessary to change next generations and to really counter the language of the gun lobby's agendas, right? And to think about being solutionaries. It's going to take a lot of connection and mobilize grassroots support across the aisles, and that it again, choosing sort of real aloha over fear and violence.
Thanks, Maya. Erica, can you talk a little bit about how Moms Demand Action is also working on this culture change piece and really trying to denormalize violence both in schools and in the home?
Yeah, there are a couple things that I wanted to highlight related to that and how we can help keep our keiki safe, our community safe. And one is safe gun storage. We know from statistics and data that more people in Hawaii, more families are owning guns. And so one message I definitely wanted to get out today was that if you do have guns in the home, there are ways to store them safely. In Hawaii, as we've talked about, suicide risk is especially important. And unfortunately, we do have higher rates of suicide and mental health issues among our young people here in Hawaii. So what we try to do at Moms Demand Action, one of our key programs is about safe storage. So we have the Be Smart program. You can go to besmartforkids.org to learn more, but a lot of it is this culture change piece. We are trying to normalize conversations about gun ownership and storage practices. For example, one of my daughters, very sadly, is very allergic to dogs. So we can, model normalizing conversations about gun safety. As a parent, before your child goes to a play date or a sleepover, you may, text or say something to the other parent, like, before I drop her off, I just want to check in with you to see if you have pets, also ask if you have guns and confirm how they're stored. We want to make sure that we know your safety rules. So those kind of conversation starters are really important, I think, in culture, change work that we're trying to do. My personal story of gun violence is related to this, and it's why this work is so important to me too. One of my dearest friends in high school was killed in an act of gun violence, shot by another one of our friends. They were so close. They lived, right down the street from each other their whole lives, and got into an argument one day. And unfortunately, because there was an unsecured firearm in the home, my friend lost his life. And we really lost two friends that day because we never saw either one of them again. So I try to tell that story to just remind all of us that it's really incumbent on us, if we do have guns in the home, to make sure that they're safely stored. It's not children's job to, know about those kind of things and how to store guns safely. So, when I look back at my beginning of those high school years, that's kind of all I remember about, my first years of high school, is planning that memorial service and that kind of thing. And so we really want to, try to tell people to try to normalize those conversations. And there's also opportunities for people to, take this message, on the road too. We train volunteers to give presentations on Be Smart and safe storage all over the state. And again, we give, things like gun locks out at public events. So, that's just a really, I think, important piece that maybe some people don't, think about. There's going to be we have more than 400 million guns, I think, in the country, right? We're not going to get rid of all the guns, but we can do more to keep our kids and our community safe.
Thanks, Erica. Chris, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about what's happening with Everytown, and also specifically, I know you're working on how to engage veterans in this work. So sharing that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So Everytown is the country's largest gun violence prevention organization, and our grassroots arm is Moms Demand Action, which has 51 chapters all over the country. I will say, just put in a plug, because Erica didn't do it explicitly, but if you're on this webinar and you're interested in this and you're not working with Moms Demand Action, sign up and do that locally. It's something tangible you can do. And obviously Erica's doing a fantastic job. My role for Everytown for gun safety is leading the national veteran engagement strategy. I do that as a consultant, and it's really I've been doing it for 5 years now. It's something that's really moved the needle for us at Everytown. The idea that we can take people, veterans who come from a profession of arms, who are respected for their service and trusted for their opinions on guns, and have them lead these gun safety conversations. It works at the federal level, it works at the grassroots level. And what we focus on is the idea that in the military, we have 3 pillars of gun culture. I'm an Army veteran myself. I'm a 4th generation Army combat veteran. I served in the 25th Infantry Division, flew Black Hawk helicopters, went to Afghanistan, was wounded in combat. So I've done a lot of training with guns and other types of weapons. And our fundamental pillars are training, safety, and accountability. And then veterans know that. Veterans learn that from their drill sergeants, and they turn around and they look at civilian society and many of the laws we've been talking about today, and they're dumbfounded. They're like, how can we have such porous gun laws? How can we not look to the military and the way that they keep their service members safe? And replicate those things in our civilian laws. And so for those of you out there who are veterans or who know veterans, use that veteran voice, speak up, and speak on gun safety, because it's a very, very powerful tool.
So we're coming up here on the end of the hour, and I want to thank everybody for joining us and point you to everyone's resources to stay engaged. So I can start. We'd love for you to continue to join our conversations at Funder Hui. So you can look us up online at funderhui.org and sign up for our email list. Chris, can you tell us a little bit on sort of what's happening at the Hawaii State Legislature and how folks can get involved?
Yeah, so, other than election season coming up next year, we're going to have another session, as we always do. And there's going to be a lot of these topics that are going to come up for discussion and maybe even passed into law. Things like better training and accountability, who has access to ammunition, magazine capacity, and things like that come up perennially. And we need people to be engaged, because the NRA and other mainland groups coming in who want to sell as many weapons as possible and convince people to loosen laws are going to be there. So engage with groups like Everytown and Moms Demand Action, and others who are already coordinating and organizing the community to get engaged there. That's really the easiest thing. No need to reinvent the wheel. Just connect with other like-minded folks and engage, or just call your representatives and senators, send an email and just say, hey, this is an issue that's important to me. I want you to keep me up to date. And when the time comes, they most certainly will.
Chris, how can folks stay engaged with Everytown?
Yeah, I think with Everytown, if you're interested in the national scope on gun violence prevention, you can of course donate to Everytown, and you can donate to the 501c3 side, which is doing a lot of programmatic stuff, or the C4 side if you're interested in the political aspects of it, and that money will filter to the right places. But also, I think educating yourself, right? Knowing some of these things, sharing it with your friends and family, a lot of great information. Everystat.org is a great place to find information on Hawaii or any state's gun violence situation. And then of course, if you want to get involved locally, then I just kick it over to Erica and she talks about that.
Thanks, Chris. We're so lucky to have Chris here in Hawaii with Everytown. Yeah, thank you all for this conversation. One thing I wanted to just leave everybody with is a Japanese proverb that Shannon Watts, which is Moms Demand Action's founder, she happens to be Buddhist. So she says this Buddhist proverb a lot, constant dripping wears away stone. So we're all these drips on a rock, right? So democracy can be so messy. It can be, really slow going sometimes and super frustrating. But together we can, create, real lasting change. So if you aren't a part of Moms Demand Action yet, I highly encourage you to get involved. You can text READY to 63344 to join our Hawaii chapter or your local group. And if you have any questions, you can also just email me directly at hawaii@momsvolunteers.org. And again, thank you for this conversation.
Maya, I'd love for you to close this out and sort of invite people to engage with Matsunaga and Seeds of Peace.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all for being here. I just think this is a wonderful group of people, both those of you who are here as panelists and those of you who are in attendance. Just remember your water, your fire, your earth, remember who we are in Hawaii. Think about that backwards mapping, envisioning our harvest and preparing the soil and planting those seeds and nurturing them to sustain. Let's not be reactive. Let's be resilient. And as we get in touch of the pain of others during this time, help one another find our way out of rage and grief to real courage, moving beyond that fight, flight, freezing. So we need to get agitated. We need to get involved and not get trapped at any point. There has been too little progress in recent decades, and our young people do feel, I think, trapped in a system that they did not create. And I would like us to heal, that grave moral injury and be radically proactive. However you can be involved, wash your eyes and let's try new things to take refuge in more than the current circumstances and stay connected and have lots more conversations, but also as we think about our guiding star goals, think about those near star goals or, just one thing that you can do today, make that commitment. We would be at the Matsunaga Institute at Seeds of Peace would love to have your participation and your familial embrace, but also take one step from today that is new. And I think that's a really good start. There's this woman, Valerie Carr, I just want to say thank you, by the way, everyone, but she talks about how these are dark days, but what if the darkness is of the womb and not the tomb? She talks about how, the midwife would tell us to breathe and push so we can have midwife moms demand action.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Let's end with that image. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to Robert from Better Tomorrow speaker series, and all the folks that are not on the Zoom but made this Zoom possible. We're grateful for all of you. And stay tuned. We're in this together. Aloha.